Hello viewers, you're watching It Matters and I'm your host Kashantakal. Since the US has retrieved their forces from Afghanistan in 2021, it has marked the end of 20 years of bloodshedding war in Afghanistan. But it also marks the return of the Taliban regime in the country. The Taliban is known for the suppression of the basic human rights like right to education, freedom of speech, etc. This kind of suppression is especially imposed on the women of the country. Many Afghans fearing the oppressive regime fled Afghanistan. Recently in Afghanistan, Taliban has restricted women and the girls of the country from working, going to public places like universities, schools, parks, gyms, etc. Let's have a quick discussion with the diplomats and experts to get to know their point of view on the issue. Taliban has banned the women and the girls of the country from using the public places like parks, gyms, universities, schools. How do you see this action by the same Taliban government who earlier this year promised its citizens in front of the whole world that they are going to provide them with full security, development, and now it's just a fake promise by Taliban?
This is an area where the Taliban have spectacularly failed to deliver on what they promised. And so if we go back to what happened when the Taliban once again swept back into power and they seized Kabul, at that time there was a real concern that the Taliban, we're going to see a return to the 1990s. So the Taliban originally rose up to power in the mid-1990s. They brought a very harsh form of rule based on their interpretation of Islamic teachings, and it was only their interpretation. And in particular, there were very repressive measures towards women and girls. And when the Taliban came back into power this time around, they said, well, we've learned, we're not the same Taliban. And we're going to protect the rights of women. They specifically said that. They said we're going to protect the rights of women. We're going to provide opportunities for women to work and to obviously pursue an education. All of these things they said they would do. And they said there would be free speech. All of that, they have actually done the exact opposite. They've suppressed free speech. They've engaged in a campaign of repression against groups that they see as opposed to them. And in particular, they've passed a series of measures that have increasingly banned women, removed women from public space. So requiring women to wear the burqa, not allowing women to go to university, not allowing girls to go to senior school. And increasingly, women are disappearing from public space. So there's no question that what the Taliban have pursued are policies that amount to gender apartheid. It's the most abhorrent form of rule that we possibly see anywhere in the world right now.
The women of the country are being restricted in the workplaces, even in the NGOs, because of which some aid funding organizations for the time being have stopped providing fund to the Afghanistan people, because of which I can say that the whole Afghan population has been suffering. How do you see this action by the aid funding organization? Is it a correct step in accordance to you? How is it?
Obviously a very challenging, it's a moral dilemma for international aid organizations. So, aid that's been provided. So what actually happened was aid organizations until recently have been able to operate in Afghanistan. And in fact, in response to the financial crisis, after a period of many, many months when all international, aid was suspended going into Afghanistan, in response to the economic and humanitarian crisis that occurred, international humanitarian aid programs resumed, and states and international organizations channeled fund support for the Afghan population through these aid programs, with aid organizations operating in Afghanistan. And so that was a key lifeline to many Afghans. But what's happened is that the aid organizations have taken the view that because women who are operating as part of their programs are now banned from working for aid organizations by the Taliban, that they are saying they can no longer operate in Afghanistan, that now they have to withdraw. I imagine that was an incredibly difficult decision that was taken by aid organizations, by people who've been working for many years with great commitment towards the Afghan people. But clearly this was a red line that just basically the Taliban crossed. It's a really hard one. I mean, on the one hand, you want to make sure that some aid is getting to Afghan civilians to reduce the impact of the economic collapse, the humanitarian catastrophe. And on the other hand, you just cannot continue to accept the increasingly repressive gender apartheid that the Taliban is
Afghanistan
pursuing.
faces one of the most severe colds in the world. On the top of that comes a lot of health problems, because of which Taliban has recently granted rights to its women of the country to work in the health sector as nurses and health supporters, not in the administration staff, but as just nurses and the health supporters. Do you think that somewhere this is a ray of light for the women of Afghanistan under the dark world of Taliban?
So an interesting question is whether we are going to see a moderating policy emerge from the Taliban. So as pressure mounts, both from the international community, but also because of the internal pressure of the economic and humanitarian disaster that's been unfolding over this past 2 years now, are you going to see the Taliban moderating their position so they don't face, millions of people dying? It is possible that there will be some minor modifications, minor moderations, such as what you just described. But are we likely to see a window opening towards the provision of more opportunity for women? Unfortunately, I'm not optimistic, and that's because the Taliban position with regards to women and the position of women in society has been consistent. It has been very, very consistent for decades. So even when they were pursuing the diplomatic negotiations with the West during the war, and they were saying we were prepared to, they're saying we're prepared to, adopt certain positions that the West would find more acceptable on things like not allowing Al-Qaeda to operate in Afghanistan and so forth. The one thing that they were when you talk to them privately, as opposed to their public statements, when you talk to them privately, the one thing that they pursued a pretty consistent position on was this hardline attitude towards women. And that's why when they came to power this time around, after they swept into Kabul, and they made these statements around they would protect the rights of women, anyone who knew anything about the Taliban were deeply skeptical towards those public statements. So I think, we might see some moderation. I don't think it's going to open up a window of greater opportunity.
The other important sector is the economic sector, where we can witness that Afghanistan's economy was already deteriorating before Taliban took over in 2021. At the current stage, we can see hunger crisis in a lot of places in Afghanistan, in a lot of households in Afghanistan. On the top of it, Taliban has just simply removed a significant amount of people from the workplaces. How do you see this action?
Major drivers of economic collapse in Afghanistan are it was a crop failure due to economic and environmental conditions. Of course, we've had terrible floods in the area as well last year. But also, it's a cash economy. It has been fundamentally a cash economy. It has been for decades. And during the war, from literally for the last 20 years, the Western war, the West was pumping, hundreds of millions of dollars into Afghanistan to sustain the economy. So that injection of cash was very, very important for sustaining the economy, and that all stopped in 2021. So that, combined with crop failure, I think are the major drivers. It doesn't help that you disenfranchise women, but actually that's more important in terms of long-term opportunity for developing the economy and short-term health and well-being of your population. But as a driver of short-term economic growth, that's probably not a significant factor.